Welcome back. Time for another episode with Patrick Morrissey. Hey, Patrick.
Good morning. How you doing, Paul?
Oh, frantic here, but we're glad we could get you on. A few technical snitches, but we're up and running this morning on the Funnel Radio Network.
Fantastic. Well, the good news is we've got a fantastic guest who's going to drop knowledge like Steph Curry drops threes. So
I love
we got a good show.
So who'd you bring with you?
I have the fabulous and talented Mr. John Kreisa, who's currently the VP of Marketing at Hortonworks. And we're going to talk a little bit about how do you scale for growth.
Hey, good morning.
Good morning. Welcome to the program. As mentioned, I want to talk about scaling for growth. I want you to drop a little knowledge and put a little international perspective on things. But before we get too deep in the weeds, why don't you take a minute to introduce yourself briefly to the audience and talk about you and your background and where you work now?
Sure, absolutely. So good to chat with you and good to chat with everybody. I'm John Kreisa. I'm currently the VP of Marketing at Hortonworks, a global data management software company based in Silicon Valley. I've been working at enterprise software companies for over 20 years doing enterprise marketing, and as you alluded to a little bit, worked in international experience everywhere from Australia to Europe and in the U.S. with sales teams, both big and small, at very small early stage startups, through to large-scale global enterprises.
Fantastic. Well, I want to get a little bit, let you share some of your experiences, lessons learned the hard way, and maybe some pointers on what to do specifically in that intersection between sales and marketing. There's a lot of stereotypes, there's a lot of conjecture, but the reality is you talked about with 20 years in enterprise. So let's start at the beginning and give me some context, particularly for early stage companies. Maybe you're pre-revenue, maybe you have a Series A, but you're a small company with a big aspiration and potentially trying to carve out some new space. What do you see as the critical ingredients that really make up the foundational elements of sales and marketing success that are allowing a company to get off the launch pad?
When you're working in a very early stage or, as you said, Series A type company, for sales and marketing, it's extremely important to be partnered closely, as you might expect. It shouldn't be the normal kind of cats and dogs relationship that you see with marketing and sales. You're effectively fighting in a foxhole together. You need to be out there trying to make sure you find the market. You're trying to define a market. So it's really a case of an entrepreneurial spirit, right? You've got a new technology. You're trying to evangelize that heavily, really try to find and discover what the repeatable process is, something that you can start to grow around. But what you're doing is you're looking to compare and contrast to existing technology, differentiate, and really carve out that market. And from a sales and marketing standpoint, you're doing it together, and it's a fast feedback loop, right, between the two organizations, as small or as large as they are at that time, in order to make sure you're making adjustments real time to the story, to the message, so that you can find that place where it really clicks and starts to scale.
So if we're talking about scale, and you also talked about being in the foxhole, you self-describe as a marketing pro, which I know you to be. When you think about who you want and what's the profile of that person who's in the foxhole in the early days with you, what's the sketch in terms of salesperson or sales leader in a small growth company that has the ability to actually execute and help you survive the night, much less take the hill or win the war?
In terms of profile, look, it is extremely hard to understand who the people are that you need to talk to. You get a lot of doors slammed in the face. You have a lot of conversations that seem like they go nowhere. So what you need, in my experience, it's got to be somebody who somewhat doesn't take no for an answer and can continue to operate in the face of, hey, we're not sure here, a lot of uncertainty. You have to be very, very comfortable with, we really just don't know where this thing is going to click. And so somebody that'll go and continue to knock on doors with you, pick up the phone, and go out and really meet prospects of a true hunter profile, if you will. All right, we've got to just go and knock down the doors and figure out what is the profile that we need and feed that back to marketing so that we can put that into the messages, adjust the tools. So it has to be somebody with that entrepreneurial spirit and the kind of don't say no and attitude.
And when you think about that fast feedback loop you mentioned for a second ago, there's a bias, I think, sometimes that salespeople just exist to do nothing but sell, as opposed to conceptualize, really understand the people and problems and the market issues. Their idea of feedback to marketing is get me a better lead. Juxtapose that oversimple sketch of a salesperson with what kind of feedback are you really looking for? And the related question is, how many of those early sales calls do you get out on part of to really, capture that real-time feedback?
Start with the second. Early days as a marketing leader, you absolutely have to be out there on the sales calls. There's the day job to do too, but this is an essential component of helping to tune the selling process. So you have to get out to a substantial number of the early sales calls. You have to be willing to make those. And what you need from a sales leader is somebody will come back, sit with you and say, okay, look, here's what I said, here's what they said to that, here's how they reacted, and even say, I think if we spin it or pitch it this way, we are actually getting to the heart of the issue, and it is around the software that we're trying to sell or the product that we're trying to sell. So we want somebody in early days in particular who is going to give that kind of very detailed feedback and can also just help partner with you to land that message and improve that message and selling process out into the market. So it's key to get details on what was said, what was reacted to, other ways to go out and pitch it, because it needs to be a team effort here.
Makes sense. So you're part of the team. You're accountable like everybody else is. If I go to the other side of the foxhole as a sales leader, and both of you are accountable to the CEO, what should a sales leader expect from his partner in marketing, and what's the measuring stick?
In terms of the expectation, right? I mean, you want to be aligned to the CEO. You want to make sure that you are working closely together. And that's not to say that everything's always going to be working, because that would be, the ideal state or nirvana state. But we know there's always going to be issues coming up. What you need is somebody you can work through the hard issues with, and then be able to work that out and not necessarily have to go to the CEO and expect the CEO to work it out. You're not children here. You need to be adults about it and have somebody that you're working with. So you definitely want to find somebody that you can partner with from a sales and marketing standpoint in the hard cases as well as the easy cases, right? The easy, when things are taking off and ramping, it's all going good. That is certainly easy, and a lot of people can get along in that environment. When it's hard is when you're still trying to struggle to find and land that message. And that happens in a lot of companies, and it's okay. You just have to be working with somebody and know that you're partnered with somebody who's going to continue to give the feedback and be constructive and positive, right? It's easy to get, as you said, just give me more leads. That's not constructive and positive. What you need is somebody who understands the role of marketing, what marketing can do, and how marketing can help sales really be successful. I mean, marketing exists, as you and I know, we've heard this many times, marketing exists to help sales sell. And we need to be there to do it. But marketing can only do that in partnership, not just, hey, give me more leads. You're not giving me good enough leads. If that's the case, or you think that's the case, well, let's sit down and talk about it, and let's figure out where the issue might or might not be.
100%. And oftentimes those conversations happen, several times a day or dozens of times a week. The question then for you is, okay, let's say you're out with your partner in sales, you're starting to get some traction, you sign the early customers, and you're starting to get a little bit of runway, which means you got to hire some help. When you think about, the first couple hires on the team and who's going to join the team that are foundational to help you scale, from a what does sales need, what does marketing need, what do those roles look like, and I guess maybe what are the skills and the traits you're looking to hire for in an early stage company?
Yep. So from a marketing standpoint, when you start to grow the team early days, of course, you want to have somebody who's focused on demand. You want everybody to somewhat be thinking about the demand process, even if they're not related to what they're doing. Everybody is trying to work on that. So I'm looking for people who are experimenters, a bit of a jack of all trades, right? I want somebody who's doing digital demand, but I need them to understand the other parts of marketing, a little bit of don't take no for an answer type of personality. Many of the early people that I've hired are like that. They're people who just won't quit. They push vendors, they push sales, they push their leaders, they push me. They are people who really have what I call a bias for action, right? They just go, go, go. And I'd much rather have somebody who is acting, who is pushing, people that are entrepreneurial spirit early days.
100%. And with a strong bias for action. What have you observed as you think about putting on the first few salespeople? Is it the same sort of skill set, bias for action, and just run through the wall? Or are there other things that you've observed either from a skills or from a traits perspective that you think a small company needs to over-index on?
Have success are the kind of run through the wall type of folks, like who just will keep going to land the sale. What the most scalable selling process or customers or any of that is. So you just need to keep going. And as you continue to grow, then you start to tune that. Particularly if you start to get a couple of customers, you can start to think of breaking it up into more hunters and farmers type organization. But early days, your first few people, first hires in international and things like that, where they don't necessarily have a lot of support, They need to be people who will run through walls and really don't take no for an answer as well. Very entrepreneurial.
What are the things that you're looking for that start to say this thing's really going to take off when you look at the sorts of behaviors you see from salespeople or for customers? What's the pattern matching, that the listener should be looking to really kind of decode? Are we just going to be blocking and tackling forever, or this thing is really starting to hit an accelerated ramp?
We're looking at the data. So, you want to look at, say, the sales cycles, what's happening, what are the use cases. If you can, set up to capture use case information early on in your Salesforce or whatever system you're using, you can actually get an idea of what are the things that are starting to catch. So you've got to catch that. You've got to have your ear to the ground to understand we're starting to see this particular pattern over and over again, or this particular use case is responding to a certain set of messages. So it's by collecting data and understanding what you're starting to see that you'll start to develop patterns. Certain companies I've been at started to see signals in specific industries, for example, whether it was in government or in financial services. You start to see patterns. So that pattern can develop cross-functional or cross-industry, or it might actually specifically be an industry. And it might be responses on your website. It can be responses to what your sales teams are saying, where you're having certain success at certain events. All the different signals are things that you need to read and understand and align and correlate that with the selling process and the selling success. And then that's going to start to tell you, hey, we're really onto something here. And maybe we need to put some more, marketing fuel on that fire to try to stoke it, kind of experiment in those areas using the data that you're getting back from the market and from your sales team.
Is there a good example when you start to think of that in terms of the signals and you start to see some of that repeatability of either some tests you can run or some examples you'd use to really flesh out if you've got true signal or not?
Yeah, let's just say you think that you've got some signal in a specific industry. Then I would tune and start to fuel more the outbound selling activity into that, whether it's going to industry-specific trade shows, targeting those specific user profiles within industry, and look at the response rates, click-through rates, and all that, plus do lead qualification so that we're bringing that through to the sales teams, and then the sales teams can give us the direct feedback on, hey, okay, I had a really good conversation with this role, and that that's led to me creating some opportunities, et cetera. So you start to listen to those, and it might be by industry where you're going to add fuel to it, you're going to add some resource to it, maybe even focus a salesperson on that specific industry and allow them to try to operate in there with some marketing backing to see if it starts to scale out for you.
Totally. And the industry thing, I got a whole bunch of questions to you on that, but I think maybe the first one is, what's the tell, or is there a natural break or a natural point in the evolution of a company where it's the right time to go industry? Because certainly there's a bias that, hey, you can't really do enterprise selling at scale unless take an industry-specific approach.
I think it really depends on the technology, if I'm honest, Pat, because that would be what I'd advise people, because I've seen it both ways. I've seen it, and that was partially because of the early signals indicated that it was going to be more of an industry play based on the technology that was there. You really, really have to read the data and understand what's going on, because certainly if you have a very general technology and you're getting signals across a bunch of different industries, well, then you want to hold and just grow without doing too much into an industry, because it is resource intensive. By putting a selling resource specifically focused on industry, putting your marketing resources specifically focused on industry, you are narrowing down more intensive to create those kinds of resources. So it is something where you really have to gauge based on the signals that you're getting and based on an understanding of the technology that you're marketing and selling when you need to make that.
Makes a ton of sense. Let's take a quick time out to pay the bills, John, and I want to pick this conversation up here in just a second.
All right.
You're only as successful as your customers, and that demands the need for an exceptional sales execution, revenue retention, and customer success. The challenge for most sales leaders and their teams, however, is that their sales process just doesn't match how their customers buy. Sustained growth isn't possible because the revenue team isn't aligned with customers and prospects. With Altify's sales transformation solutions, companies can deliver predictable revenue growth. Yes, we said predictable revenue growth. They can also acquire and retain customers, and they can collaborate across the revenue team to qualify and win new business while delivering value that unlocks cross-sell and upsell opportunities. Built natively on the Salesforce platform, Altify helps salespeople, managers, and executives achieve sustained revenue growth. They help accelerate sales performance for Autodesk, Comcast, GE, Honeywell, Salesforce, Tableau, and United Healthcare. They can do the same for you. Visit Altify.com Altify.com. Just like it sounds, Altify, Altify.com. And now back to Patrick and his guest.
We're really talking about that sales and marketing intersection, about what's required to get to scale and get to growth that all of us are looking for. You mentioned there was no hard and fast rule, John, between when it's the right time to go industry specific. One of the dialogues in sales that seems to be as old as time is public sector is totally different from selling in commercial. And I've had other sales leaders say to me, you know what, other than the fact that customers are called constituents, it's almost 100% the same. Where do you fall on that spectrum, and what's your point of view?
I'm more biased towards it's a different market. You typically are selling through specific government resellers to the government fiscal year. So there are a lot of things that make it different. It is a different market. They tend to think differently. Now, a lot of the problems you might solve are the same. I lean towards it's different. I would always look for places I can get economies of scale across all of my marketing efforts. But typically I have seen and have set up separate government marketing, sales and marketing functions.
You know, you're a Silicon Valley guy. That's home base for you. But you have done tours of duty in Australia. You've worked in Paris. You've lived outside of London, oftentimes for technology companies. And I think particularly there's this notion that everything that important happens in Silicon Valley and then the rest of the world will figure it out at some point. What's your point of view in real life, and kind of juxtapose for me how it works in the Valley when you think about, you know, sales and go-to-market versus what you might have seen in some of the other international areas that you've lived in?
There's definitely lots of technology, great technology is created in Silicon Valley, some that's not. And the typical startup attitude is win the U.S. and then move overseas. And as you said, that kind of the rest of the world will figure it out in time. I've definitely seen it both ways in terms of technology adoption, in that other areas or other regions of the world are able to leap directly to newer, innovative technologies, right? They're early adopters. Now, that varies very heavily by region, right? I'd say that there are certain pockets of Europe that tend to be, you know, a little bit more conservative on technology adoption, but I've seen parts of Asia which tend to lean into technology adoption, whether you're talking about ASEAN region in Singapore or Australia. Like they might be a little bit more entrepreneurial and move to new technologies more quickly. So it depends on the technology. If you're talking about kind of core data technologies, then the adoption might be a bit slower. If you're talking about analytics technologies, the adoption might be a bit faster. Sellers that I've worked with in all those places, there's great sellers in every geography, you know, that kind of core ability to go out there and knock down doors and sell and close deals. It really is a matter of the market differences, and it's really a matter of the the technology that you're working with. Really, for each company, they're going to have to work their way through how quickly they decide if they started in Silicon Valley, if they're going to make that leap. Often what we see is, and I think this is very common practice, the first move is to some place like London, because of common language and things like that, and it makes it a little bit easier. So you really have to judge it based on the company and the technology you're moving.
Yeah, and you mentioned something that I think is important, that there are great salespeople, great sales leaders everywhere, but there's also some nuances around culture. So I'm winning whatever I'm selling, but just technology generically, we're winning the U.S., we're expanding globally, so we drop some sales and marketing talent into London and Paris, or maybe said differently, what are the common mistakes you see particularly tech companies make when they go to spin up an outpost in some place like London or Paris?
One of the common mistakes, I would say, is that it is culturally the same, right? I mean, it is the UK, it's two countries separated by a common language. The cultures are similar, but they are important differences. I think there's important differences in the culture of selling, and there are some important differences in terms of just the culture in general. So I'd say that's one, like just not understanding quite the nuances and the way that selling is done in the US, not recognizing that there are differences. Say the other thing is you have to hire the right sales people, because typically, as you said, you're dropping first a couple of sellers, and maybe to include the technical side of selling into a country or region. You have to get those extremely entrepreneurial people, because they are way out on the pointy end of the spear or on an island, or whichever analogy you want to use. So they have to be comfortable working with very, very little support from a marketing and generally from a company standpoint, until they can start to find some revenue and start to justify the additional resource and investment in that area. Can't hire somebody who's expecting to get full support immediately, because they won't be successful and you will have just wasted a lot of time. It's important to get the right kind of entrepreneurial people, but they absolutely exist. To your point, out there in all of those countries, you can find those great people to work with.
So let's talk about sales and marketing at scale, because you have a leadership position now and have multiple leadership positions in public companies. When you think about what good to great looks like in sales and marketing, both in the relationship and the operational cadence, what's top of mind? And kind of back to the earlier question I asked you, what kind of skills and traits are you looking for when you're hiring on your team?
In sales, you're moving from pure hunters to a combination of hunters and farmers. Obviously, from a marketing standpoint, moving to people who are more specialized in terms of their abilities. So you're really looking for people who are deeper and deeper into their specific skill area, still with somewhat of a breadth of knowledge across marketing, particularly in the leadership positions that you're hiring. But your line managers and specific skill people are getting deeper into their expertise. You're beginning to grow the team, and you need people who know how to scale and operationalize those components. And as the sales team starts to segment and grow the different kinds of salespeople, you need to be able to provide the right kinds of tools, leads, and kind of integration, if you will, with that sales org as you're trying to grow and drive demand. So you're looking for people who are more specific in terms of their skills, very demand focused, and starting to grow and operationalize, and probably who've had some experience in other organizations, operationalizing marketing around demand engine at scale, the lead flow and the demand flow within the organization, and moving that through. Those are the things I think people should be thinking about. Once you've started to get and understand what the repeatable selling processes and use cases are, and sales are starting to grow, you have to scale marketing commensurately to be able to meet those needs of the organization.
And the world's a much different place than when you and I started and got our first jobs in marketing. What's different in sales now than when you first joined the workforce and first got into tech?
I mean, there's a tremendous amount of technology that's available to a seller now. That's what I've seen in terms of helping them understand and do account planning, territory planning, and understanding what the digital signals are where they can go and look for opportunities. The number of tools out there for intention to buy and things like that, for getting a view of account and an account plan, the digital signals across the plan, for a seller now are better than ever, right? There are so many different tools and technology. So a good seller these days really, to me, understands how to use those tools and technologies to go and prosecute their leads, prosecute and sell into their patch, regardless of how big or what that patch looks like. I think that's the biggest difference, Pat, is the tools that somebody has or a seller has to understand, okay, where's a buying group? Where are the opportunities? Where's intent that I can or can't see? There's so many things that are not only the digital signals that you're receiving directly to your organization, but ability to click into and tap into digital signals outside of your organization, which give you a very broad view of where the opportunities might be that you might see, or opportunities that you don't see that you need to go and uncover.
And the world is much more digital. And when you think about that now in terms of how do you bring all these pieces together at scale, what would be your kind of main lessons learned or rules of thumb in terms of trying to drive that sales and marketing alignment that's going to get you to consistently capturing revenue, making the plan, and driving performance?
One is marketing exists to help sales. So we want to align to and with and partner with sales leadership, sales all the way up and down the organization, whether it's with the field sellers through to line managers, all the way up to sales leadership. But we need to make sure we're aligned around targeting, revenue, and pipelines. It's clearly the thing that's going to make sure we're continuing to drive and grow the organization. Secondly, I look for and encourage a bias for action. I want people in the organization who are going to be doing and are moving forward with direction, with guidelines. But if they don't, I want people who are not sitting back on their heels, but are thinking and taking action and moving forward. So bias for action. A third thing that I really look for, and we use heavily and have used heavily in many organizations, is really to measure and analyze, right? You've got to be able to instrument your demand engine and understand everything that's happening both in the demand engine and really more broadly across marketing, right? There's enough digital tools out for measuring the metrics and what's happening, and to analyze that, to look for those signals. So you've got to use data and measure and analyze. Thirdly, I want to make sure we're thinking at scale. I tend to think, in terms of things like content, like let's create content that can be used in multiple ways. I tell people, let's make sure we're using content at scale, and really everything we do We need to be thinking at scale. And then final, just be collaborative across the organization, both within marketing, but to all the other components, because the only way for you to be successful as a marketer, as a seller, really in general, is to make sure you're collaborating openly with the other parts, because that will help you be a better marketer and I think be a better seller and really help drive the organization towards its goals.
And you're actually hitting on something with that last point around collaboration that I think is critical, John, which is, I think all the best sellers that I observe and the best teams I observe know that selling is a team sport. Any best practices or suggestions you'd give in terms of how do you drive that collaboration and enable that culture to make sure that your team is actually executing to full advantage?
The first thing is really to limit yourself. Lead by example is what I try to do, and that's what I look for in leaders, and it's what I encourage across the organization. I think that's one. Two, you can set up forums and try to do things that encourage that across the organization, whether it's feedback Fridays or lunch and learns. There's just different ways to create open forums for communication and collaboration, making sure that you are living it, but also encouraging it through the forms and functions and processes you put in place within the organization. That can help make sure that you're encouraging collaboration. You don't want to do things by committee. You need to make sure you do that within reasonable structure and organization, but definitely you can encourage it within the organization yourself.
Absolutely, and that's probably a good lead up to kind of the summary question. When you think about across your career, the best sales leader or leaders you've ever worked with, who's the person that stands out to you and why?
Given the span of my career in the regions and geographies and places I've worked, I've been fortunate to work with many great sales leaders, as I'm sure you have too. One of the leaders I've worked with was very good at managing, for example, the qualification process. And this is just a kind of lesson learned that I always took away from, because I always really appreciated this. He always asked his teams during kind of the deal review process, he asked them what he calls the why buys. And those are, why buy now, why buy from us, and why buy anything. It's an interesting set of questions to ask someone who's trying to sell to a customer or prospect and thinks they have a deal. Because it turns out if you can answer those questions, then you are definitely well on your way to having a deal. So I always appreciate the why buy questions. There's many different ways to obviously qualify, MedPick and many others, but those are three very simple ones. If you can't answer them, then it's really hard to believe that you're getting towards a deal.
And I think that's what we're all trying to do, is understand what are the signals, what do we need to do to get a little closer to a deal. If folks want to find out more from you or get more of your insight, what's the best way to get in contact?
Just reach out to me through LinkedIn. Any further questions?
Fantastic. Well, just wrapping up today with John Kreisa, VP of Marketing for Hortonworks. John, thanks so much for your time, and good luck in the foxhole and happy selling.
Thanks, Pat. Thank you.
You've been listening to Predictable Revenue Radio with your host, Patrick Morrissey, Chief Marketing Officer at Altify, the sales transformation company. One of the many shows here on the ever-growing Funnel Radio channel for at-work listeners like you.